folks, Brian Haynes here with a workshop update on the grooving plane that I was working on. In the last video I mentioned that this guy was having some trouble with this grooving plane because the cutter wasn't staying set. The problem turned out to be simple. These bits are quite polished when I get them from the manufacturer. So it was a simple matter of scratching up the surface a little bit so that the wedge and the bed could get a grip onto the cutter. Now that was just the tip of the iceberg because there's actually quite a few other problems I discovered with this design. But before I get into the problems with this, let me go over the basic idea. Now one way to make a grooving plane is to incorporate right on the plane a fence that you use to guide along the edge of your stock to set the distance, to give as a straight reference and to give you a reference how far up the groove is going to be. There's two limitations to this approach that I wanted to overcome. One is that when you put a fence on one side of a plane, now it's either right-handed or left-handed, and if you've worked with hand tools, you'll know that sometimes you have to turn around and come the other way just to deal with the way the grain is in the wood. So you need a pair of hand planes to do a proper job, a pair for each size to do a proper job. The other limitation that I didn't like about having a fence right on the plane itself is the distance from the bottom of your drawer stock to the bottom of the groove is fixed. You can't. There's no way to adjust that. Now, maybe that's not a big deal, but a lot of times, if you're doing some dovetail drawers and you're trying to just miss that bottom pin, you want to bring up the groove a little bit, as opposed to making your dovetails match the groove instead. I'd much rather have the flexibility in the design of the dovetails and be able to adjust the height of my groove to match that. So the solution to getting rid of the fence that's mounted directly on to the plane is to use an auxiliary fence. So instead of using the fence that's directly on the plane itself, you take your workpiece and you clamp a reference fence to it, and then you use the side of the plane as a guide. That gives you your distance, that gives you your straight edge, a reference, and the distance from the bottom of the groove to the bottom of the drawer stock can be adjusted by simply adding a shim and moving over the hand plane a little bit. Now, using an auxiliary fence is not a new idea in my shop. I've always used an auxiliary fence as an alternative to using a shooting board to square up stock, simply by having the auxiliary fence in a vise and clamping it together with my stock, and then using a hand plane that has a 90-degree reference against that auxiliary fence, and that gives me my nice, allows me to make a nice 90-degree edge without having to fiddle around and measure a bunch of times. Now let's get to some of the problems with this hand plane, this small hand plane. One is that because it's so narrow, you have to use the shoulder plane idea of letting the chips eject through a hole in front of the cutter. And that works okay on some planes, but because I have this up against a reference fence, I only have one side of to eject the shavings, and I found this keeps getting clogged. And if I have to keep unclogging the shavings, it's not saving me any time by doing it this way. So I had to make the hole pretty large, and I didn't really care to have that hole that large to be able to eject. The second thing is this is really thin, and it's very uncomfortable to actually use. And so again, it's uncomfortable, and if it takes me more time than going to the router table, why bother with a grooving plane? The last thing is adjusting the distance from the bottom of the groove to the bottom of the drawer stock. By adding the shim, you have to come up with a method of keeping this in place, because as you start planing, you'll find that this shim will move around a lot. So that was also another problem that had to be solved. Now, so regarding the chip ejection, it'd be nice if I could eject the chips out the top like a regular hand plane. But again, how do you deal with the fact that it's only an 1/8 inch wide cutter? So the solution I came up with the new hand planes, the new grooving planes, actually solved all 3 problems in one fell swoop. What I did was I added what I call a secondary cheeks. So what I've done is there are 2 pieces either side of the bed that are only deep enough, just a little bit deeper than the cutter itself. And what that does is it allows the cutter to stay right in the center, but at the same time it widens the whole hand plane. Now there's plenty of room for that chip to come up and eject through the top. Much more convenient, especially when I got this up against the fence. And the second thing that it does, it makes a much larger hand plane. That's not huge, it's an 1.1 inch wide, my largest one is 1.25 inches wide. But it gives you a little bit more to hold on to so you can work a little bit easier and much more comfortable to use. That way I'll use this to do a half a dozen drawers worth of grooves without getting too tired. The last thing it does, and you might have caught on, is like now my distance between my bottom of my groove and here into the side of the plane, or which is going to translate to the bottom of the groove to the bottom of the drawer stock, is 1/2 inch. So what am I going to do about that? Now remember how that I was adding stock, adding a shim to get my right distance. Well, instead, now what I'm doing is I'm clamping that shim to get my right distance right between the reference fence and the drawer stock itself. So just by adjusting the thickness of this shim in between determines how far up my groove is going to be. And I don't have to worry about it sliding back and forth because it's all clamped together. So it's a nice, neat package once I get this set up. So let me show you how I go about making a groove.
The first step is to clamp the auxiliary fence, the spacer, and the drawer stock into the vise using the bench dogs. Before starting to plane, I like to check to make sure that the auxiliary fence is square with the drawer stock. The first few passes are critical in order to establish the groove. So for this I like to use an extra reference blocks just to make sure I keep my hand plane square to the stock. Once the groove is started, I can use the reference block and go to town in removing stock. I keep removing stock until the secondary soles of the plane start to bottom out and the plane no longer cuts. Now you can start to hear that some of the spots are actually bottomed out and no longer cutting. A little bit more and we'll be finished. And now you can distinctly hear that the plane is no longer cutting because the secondary soles have bottomed out. And let's take a look. Voila.
Now as you can see, that went pretty quickly for doing it by hand. And that was my largest, that was a 1/4 inch grooving plane, which actually takes the longest. So yeah, I'm really excited about these planes. I'm going to be using these a lot. Now one other note, as far as the shim goes, there was 2 ways I could go about it. I could make a whole set of shims of different thicknesses to get me what I want, but usually when I'm doing a project, I'm usually doing a bunch of templates up front anyways. So what I'll usually do is I'll just take a piece of my drawer stock, slice it off, and make it the width that's going to accommodate whatever distance from the bottom of the drawer that I want, and use that one shim through the whole project. So that's all I have for this update. Thanks for stopping by, and until next time, leave your dogma at the door.